Welcome to the demonstration on installing IDE devices. In this demonstration, we will show the installation of a hard disk, a CD drive, and a floppy drive. Let us first install a hard disk. To begin installing a hard disk, we need to first configure the hard disk as a master or a slave drive. This is done by placing this small plastic piece known as the jumper pin onto these pins that are on the rear side of the hard disk. The jumper settings determine the configuration of the hard disk as master or slave. We will configure this hard disk as master. To know the jumper settings for master and slave, one needs to look on the back panel of the hard disk for this label. This label gives the information about the jumper settings of master and slave for that particular hard disk. Next, we mount the hard disk in this enclosure. To mount the hard disk, we simply slide the hard disk into the enclosure and gently push the hard disk until it is firmly fixed. We then fasten the drive into the enclosure using these screws meant for the hard drive. One must remember not to over-tighten the screws. We next connect the drive to the motherboard using this IDE bus cable. The IDE bus cable is specific to the hard disk because the number of pin slots corresponds to these pin connectors on the rear side of the hard disk. The bus cable has these two connectors. This is called master and this is called slave. Since the hard disk here is configured as the master, we connect the master connector to it. This red line running on the edge of the cable should be facing outward, like this, while connecting. This is the third connector of the bus cable. It is connected to the motherboard. These are the IDE interfaces on the motherboard to which either a hard disk or a CD drive can be connected. The third connector of the IDE bus cable is connected to this IDE interface. The red line on the bus cable should be facing outward, as shown here. Finally, we connect the hard disk to the PSU. The PSU has these power connectors. The power connectors are meant to connect the hard disk and the CD drive. We connect one of these connectors to the hard disk firmly. While connecting, this red marked side of the cable should be facing the IDE connector as shown. The hard disk is now installed in the system. Next, we will install a CD drive. Its installation is similar to the installation of a hard disk. This is the rear side of the CD drive where the power cable and the IDE cables are connected. To mount the drive on the system unit, we insert the drive into the system unit and push it until only the front panel of the CD drive is visible. We then fasten the CD drive with these screws. Next, we connect the slave connector of the IDE bus cable already connected to the hard disk. The CD drive is now the secondary drive. In some cases, a separate IDE bus cable is also connected to the CD drive. In such cases, then the CD drive is independent of the hard disk. We next connect the CD drive to the PSU with one of these power connectors. Note that the power connector that we are attaching to the CD drive is similar to the power connector we had attached to the hard disk. Next, we will install a floppy drive. This is the front side of the floppy drive that is visible from the outside of the system unit. This is the rear side where the IDE and power cables are connected. This is the enclosure for mounting the floppy drive. To mount the drive, we simply slide the floppy drive into this enclosure and push gently until fixed firmly. We then use these screws to fasten the floppy to its enclosure. Next, we connect the floppy drive to the motherboard. This is the IDE bus cable, which is meant to connect the floppy drive to the motherboard. Note that this IDE bus cable is different from the IDE bus cable we had used to connect the hard disk and the CD drive to the motherboard. One end of the cable is specific to the motherboard and the other is specific for the floppy drive. Note the number of pin connectors on the rear of the floppy drive. The number of pin connectors and their settings are different from that of the hard disk and CD drive. This connector of the IDE bus cable has the corresponding pin slots to the pin connectors on the floppy drive. This is how we attach it to the floppy drive. This is the IDE interface on the motherboard to which the other end of the IDE bus cable is connected. Finally, we connect the floppy drive to the PSU. We connect the power cable with the smallest power connector to the floppy drive. Note that the red line on the IDE bus cable is in the opposite direction to the red cable of the PSU connector. So, now we have the three IDE devices, hard disk, CD drive, and the floppy drive installed. This brings us to the end of this demonstration on installing IDE devices.